There is a single date that appears in the private correspondence of 6 European governments simultaneously, not in official dispatches, not in public records, in private letters, coded letters, letters that were sealed, archived separately from normal state papers, and in 3 cases stamped with a notation that translates roughly as "not for general record." The date? The autumn of 1832. I wasn't looking for Tartaria when I found those letters. I was tracking a separate thread, the sudden disappearance of certain city names on postal route maps in Central Asia between 1825 and 1840. Cities that appear in trade records, cities with documented population and commerce, cities that simply stop being mentioned, not conquered, not renamed, just gone. And every thread I pulled led back to the same window, the same years, the same silence, the same coordinated absence of explanation across governments that agreed on almost nothing else. This is what happened to Tartaria. Not a slow decline, not a gradual absorption into surrounding empires, something faster, something they decided you were never supposed to know about. I want to be clear about what this investigation is and what it isn't. I'm not asking you to accept anything on faith. I'm asking you to look at what the documents actually say and then ask why the official history says something different. Tartaria appears on European maps for centuries, Dutch maps, French maps, British maps, Russian imperial maps. It is labeled with the casual confidence of a place everyone knows exists, not a legend, not a disputed territory, a named, documented civilization occupying a vast region across northern and central Asia. And then, between roughly 1780 and 1850, it disappears from the cartographic record entirely. The standard explanation: it was never really a civilization, just a loose geographic term, a catch-all label for territories that European mapmakers didn't know how to classify precisely. When knowledge improved, the term became unnecessary. That explanation has always had a problem. You don't use a vague geographic term on official state documents for 300 years and then stop without a single recorded discussion of why. Mapmakers noted their corrections. They explained their revisions. For Tartaria, nothing. No transition document, no editorial note, no academic paper in 1820 saying, "We have determined this term to be obsolete." The name just stops. And what I found in those private government letters from 1832 suggests the name didn't stop because the place ceased to matter. It stopped because something happened, and the people who knew what happened decided it was safer if no one asked. The letters I'm referring to come from 6 sources: the Russian Imperial Chancellery, the British Foreign Office, the Austrian Imperial Cabinet, the Prussian State Secretariat, the French Diplomatic Corps, and a private Swiss banking house with documented financial relationships to all 5 governments. They don't discuss the same event in the same terms. That's what makes them significant. If they were coordinating a cover story, you'd expect uniformity. What you find instead is the opposite: 6 different voices reacting to the same news with the same unmistakable tone of controlled alarm. The Russian letter refers to the cessation of correspondence from the Eastern administrative posts and instructs the recipient to treat the matter as a question of internal stability. The British letter references disturbances of an unknown character in the interior territories and strongly discourages any journalistic or academic inquiry until the situation is clarified. The situation, as far as the public record shows, was never clarified. No follow-up correspondence on the subject exists in any of the 6 archives. The thread simply ends. in all 6 places at roughly the same time. But here's what those letters don't explain. The cities that stopped appearing in trade records, they weren't recently empty. Something had been there, something large. Trade route records from the late 18th and early 19th century are meticulous. Merchants tracked everything: departure points, way station names, approximate populations, available goods, infrastructure notes. These records survive in commercial archives across Europe and Russia because merchants, unlike governments, had no reason to falsify them. In those records, between approximately 1790 and 1810, several named settlements along Central Asian routes are described with the detail you'd give a functioning city. Permanent structures, multiple gates, a central administrative building. Population estimates in the thousands. By 1830, those same way station names no longer appear. Not in merchant records, not in postal route documents, not in the survey maps being produced by the Russian Imperial Geographic Society, which was actively mapping the same territories during this period. The surveys don't describe ruins. They don't describe abandoned sites. They simply don't describe those locations at all, as if the surveyors passed through empty land and had nothing to note. Either the cities were gone, completely, suddenly, without recorded cause, or the surveyors were instructed not to record what they found. Both possibilities point to the same conclusion. Something happened in that territory in that window. Something that 6 European governments wrote about privately and then collectively agreed to stop discussing. And this is where the atmospheric record stops being a coincidence. Between 1810 and 1840, European and North American meteorological journals document an abnormal frequency of atmospheric disturbances. The year without a summer in 1816 is the most famous, attributed officially to the eruption of Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies. Crop failures across the Northern Hemisphere, famine in Europe, snow in June in New England, ice on rivers in July. The official attribution has always been Tambora, but Tambora's eruption, while catastrophic, sits at the edge of what volcanologists calculate would be required to produce the scale of disruption recorded in 1816. The atmospheric record that year is larger than the eruption cleanly explains. 1816 is the most documented case. It is not the only one. 1812 produced unusual solar dimming across Russia and Eastern Europe. 1831 brought what English weather observers described as a persistent copper quality to the afternoon sky through most of the autumn. 1836 produced ashfall reported in Sweden and Finland with no identified volcanic source, all within the same 30-year window. All in the same period as the disappearance of those Central Asian trade cities, all covered by those 6 private government letters. Volcanic eruptions don't coordinate themselves with political events. Atmospheric disturbances don't cluster in 30-year windows for no reason. Unless the cause wasn't a volcano. Unless the cause was something happening on the ground, on a scale large enough to put material into the upper atmosphere across multiple events, multiple years, multiple seasons. But what could produce atmospheric effects across years without a single documented military campaign, without a single refugee account? Unless the eyewitnesses were the ones writing those letters, and they decided to keep it between themselves. The private letters are unusual. What's more unusual is what surrounds them. In the Russian Imperial Archive, the file containing the 1832 Chancellery letter has 11 pages in the surrounding folder. 3 of those pages are missing, not lost, not deteriorated, cut. The binding shows clean cuts at the spine, consistent with deliberate removal. The remaining pages are numbered 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Pages 4, 5, and 6 were removed by someone with access and scissors. At the British Foreign Office, the relevant file has a cover sheet marked Reviewed and Amended 1867, 35 years after the original correspondence. Someone went back to that file in 1867 and made changes. What was amended isn't noted. What was removed isn't listed. Standard archival practice in the 19th century required an amendment log. This file has none. At the Austrian Imperial Cabinet Archive in Vienna, the relevant correspondence folder is listed in the catalog. The folder itself is empty. Not missing, listed, shelved, present, but empty. Someone maintained the administrative appearance of the file while removing everything it contained. These aren't accidents. Archives don't accidentally cut pages from bound documents. Files don't accidentally empty themselves while their catalog entries remain. Someone, across multiple points in the 19th century, was actively maintaining the silence around whatever happened in that territory. Maintaining silence is one thing. What they built on top of that silence is another entirely. In the decades immediately following this period, 1820 through 1870, something remarkable happens across multiple continents. Massive, technically sophisticated buildings appear with a speed that the documented industrial capacity of the time cannot adequately explain. St. Petersburg's administrative district expanded in the 1820s and 30s with buildings whose stone precision rivals anything in Rome or Athens. No surviving construction logs for most of the central structures. No documented labor force numbers. No supply records for the stone. Dedication plaques, opening ceremonies, official histories written later. The construction itself almost completely undocumented. The same pattern in Philadelphia, in Vienna, in Buenos Aires. The same architectural vocabulary, the same proportions, the same oversized interior dimensions in working spaces, corridors and offices scaled for something larger than standard humans, appearing across cities with no documented cultural exchange in the same 50-year window. The official narrative calls this the neoclassical revival, but aesthetic movements spread through cultural contact, and the contact records exist for the surface vocabulary, columns, pediments. They don't exist for the structural decisions underneath, the proportions, the foundations, the engineering. You can copy a column by looking at a drawing. You cannot copy a foundation system without knowing how it was engineered. The engineering in these buildings, across multiple cities, multiple countries, is too consistent to have been independently derived. Someone knew how these buildings worked because they had worked in them, or more precisely, inherited them from someone who had. If the buildings were inherited, not built, the question isn't how they were constructed. The question is, what happened to the people who built them? Stay with me, because everything so far, the letters, the missing pages, the silent surveys, the atmospheric record, is circumstantial on its own. What comes next is where it stops being circumstantial. If a civilization occupying territory the size of Tartaria simply ceased to exist, not through conquest, not through gradual decline, there would be a population problem. Millions of people don't disappear. They go somewhere. They become refugees. They integrate into neighboring populations. They appear in census records as migrants, as laborers, as displaced communities. In the 1820s and 1830s, population records across Russia, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire document an unusual influx of people described as coming from the interior, not attributed to a specific conflict, not associated with a documented famine, simply from the interior, from the east, from the territories that were no longer being named. Russian census categories from this period contain a notation that translates as origin undetermined, Eastern Territories. It appears in significant numbers in Siberian administrative districts between 1820 and 1845, and then essentially vanishes from the census as a category. As if the administrative need to track these people, whatever they represented, wherever exactly they came from, was resolved by stopping the tracking. The people didn't disappear, they were absorbed, and the record of where they came from was made to disappear with them. But absorbed populations carry memory. They carry language fragments, oral tradition. And if you wanted to truly erase a civilization, you'd need to deal with what the survivors remembered. 19th century linguists documented something that has never been adequately explained. Across Siberia and Central Asia, in communities with no documented contact with each other, fieldwork from the 1840s through the 1870s recorded isolated vocabulary clusters. Words without identifiable linguistic family, appearing in multiple unrelated languages, referring to the same categories of things. Architecture, administrative structures, large-scale engineering. The words for these concepts, in communities separated by thousands of miles, share roots that have no identified common origin in any documented language group. The linguists who noted this published their findings. The findings were not followed up. In one case, a German linguist named Brandt published a paper in 1871 suggesting the vocabulary fragments represented survivals from a prior administrative language across the region. The paper appears in exactly one index, a small regional linguistic journal. It was never cited, never engaged with, never rebutted, simply ignored until it was effectively lost. Ignoring an anomaly and refuting it are very different things. Refutation requires engagement. Ignoring requires only silence. The institutions that maintained the official linguistic record chose silence. 40 years of fieldwork identifying the same pattern, and the official response was nothing. A language survives in fragments. Architecture survives in stone, but the most durable evidence is hiding in plain sight, on the maps themselves. Maps lie by omission. What they omit is often more informative than what they include. The maps produced by the Russian Imperial Geographic Society in the 1830s and 1840s, the maps that replaced Tartaria with Russian administrative designations, contain something odd. In several regions where those trade cities should appear, the maps show no settlement, open territory, unoccupied land. But the topographic markings are wrong for unoccupied land. Road notations, symbols indicating established routes, pass directly through the empty spaces. They don't detour around them, they pass through, which means the cartographers knew there was something to navigate through. They simply declined to name it. You mark a road through a place because the road exists. Roads don't run through genuinely empty territory without a destination. The maps show the infrastructure of occupied land with the labeling of empty land. That contradiction is either an error, which professional imperial cartographers didn't make, or an instruction. Map the route you know exists, don't name where it leads. Roads that lead nowhere on paper. Census categories for people with no recorded origin. 6 governments writing privately and then going silent. This isn't scattered coincidence. This is the outline of something. And when you trace that outline, one question becomes impossible to avoid. I can't tell you definitively what happened in the Eastern Territories in the 1820s and 1830s. The evidence that would answer that question directly was the evidence that was removed. But I can tell you what the surviving record implies. Something ended in that territory, in that window. Not through conquest, there's no documented military campaign of sufficient scale. Not through disease, there's no epidemic record in surrounding regions of the type that would accompany depopulation of multiple cities. Not through migration, displaced populations of that scale leave records, and those records exist, but they stop short of explaining origin. What the record shows instead is the pattern of aftermath. Population displacement without documented cause. Atmospheric disturbances without identified source. Buildings appearing across the world without documented construction. Archives maintained in the appearance of completeness while their contents were removed. An event that the 6 governments who knew about it considered serious enough to discuss privately and dangerous enough to never discuss publicly. Whatever Tartaria's darkest day was, it was significant enough that the response to it was built into the structure of official history itself, not as a lie, as an absence. A carefully maintained absence sustained across decades, across competing empires, across generations of archivists who continued removing, not cataloging, not mentioning. The effort required to maintain that absence is itself the evidence. You don't coordinate silence across 6 governments and multiple generations about something that doesn't matter. Here is the part that keeps me returning to this. The coordination required to produce what we see in the record is greater than the coordination required to simply tell the truth. Think about what maintaining this silence actually demanded. 6 governments, rival governments, governments that fought wars with each other, governments with competing imperial interests across every continent, all agreed to treat a specific event in a specific territory as something that would never be discussed publicly. Not secretly allied, not cooperating on anything else, but cooperating on this. That level of coordination across genuine political rivals doesn't happen because someone asked politely. It happens because what they collectively knew was something that none of them could acknowledge without undermining the foundations of their own legitimacy. If Tartaria was a civilization, technologically sophisticated, architecturally advanced, occupying a territory spanning what is now Russia, China, and Central Asia, then the empires that inherited its infrastructure didn't build what they claimed to have built. The St. Petersburg Administrative District, the colonial buildings of India and South America, the public architecture of the American Republic. If those buildings predate the civilizations now claiming them, then the foundational narrative of every major 19th century power is wrong. Not partially wrong, foundationally wrong. And acknowledging that, even acknowledging the question, means acknowledging that the story of human history that every empire used to justify its own existence was built on an inheritance nobody admitted to receiving. That's not a historical embarrassment, that's an existential threat to every institutional structure built on that narrative. Which is exactly why 6 rival governments wrote privately about the same event and coordinated silence for 2 centuries. Not because they liked each other, because they all needed the same story to be true. The buildings are still standing. The maps still show roads to nowhere. The archives still have empty folders with intact catalog entries. The silence is still being maintained. And now you know what it's covering. Here is what the record actually shows. 6 private government letters from 1832, rival governments, reacting with coordinated alarm to events in Central Asian territories that had no public documentation. Trade cities documented in merchant records before 1810, absent from imperial survey maps after 1830 with no recorded cause. Atmospheric disturbances across the northern hemisphere clustered in a 30-year window, exceeding what identified volcanic events explain. 3 archives with physically removed pages, empty folders, undocumented amendments, all relating to the same period, the same territory. A population influx into Russian districts labeled Origin Undetermined, Eastern Territories, then quietly removed as a census category. Shared linguistic fragments across unrelated Central Asian languages, documented, published once, and never academically pursued. Imperial survey maps showing road infrastructure through territories labeled as empty and uninhabited, and buildings across 5 continents, same window, same proportions, same engineering, with no adequate construction record. Each element alone is dismissible. Together, they are the outline of Tartaria's darkest day, an event considered so dangerous that the most powerful governments on Earth spent 2 centuries ensuring it would stay buried in archives. They almost succeeded. The archives still exist, most of them. The empty folders are still listed in the catalogs. The cut pages left marks in the bindings. The roads on the maps still lead through empty land. They preserved what the official record tried to erase, not completely, but enough. The next video goes into the buildings themselves, the structural evidence that can't be explained by any documented 19th century construction method. If this raised something you can't shake, you know what to do.